Well, we are getting ready to celebrate Christmas 2019, and of course, that is where Christians around the world recognize the birth of our Savior Jesus Christ. But of course, Christmas would mean very little if it wasn't for the cross and ultimately for the resurrection of Jesus. So, how can we actually be sure that this resurrection that we celebrated Easter actually happened? Well, you're listening to Why Do You Believe, the podcast of Southern Evangelical Seminary. My name's Adam Tucker, and joining us today is cold case homicide detective and SES adjunct professor and senior fellow with the Colson Center, J. Warner Wallace. J. Warner Wallace, thank you for joining us, sir.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Glad we got to do it.
We appreciate you taking the time to be here. I know you're a busy guy. And if you're listening to the podcast, you can't see this, but if you see the video, you'll see the nice goatee that he has grown, and I really like it. It looks good, so I think you should keep it. Just my two cents.
For years I worked undercover, and I would never. I mean, I have like a 4-year period there where you could not. I didn't cut my hair for 4 years. It was ridiculous, right? and I got so used to it. But now I only let myself grow goatee usually when I'm not traveling and speaking. So I have it, but you made a good point when you said, you think about the resurrection, mostly connecting it to Easter. Like if there's a Christian holiday that rests on this event, that's Easter, right?
Right.
Well, to be honest, why would we be selling anyone's birthday? We could, but why would it have the kind of momentous importance it has if it's not for the fact we're not celebrating the birth of another guy in the history of guys?
Right.
Because the resurrection demonstrates this is something entirely different. So I think you're right. I mean, the resurrection, I think, is key and central to the Christmas story as it is to the Easter story.
So, we hear a lot about defenses of the resurrection. Of course, Gary Habermas is probably the world's leading expert on that right now.
Yep.
Of course, our friend Mike Licona and others. But I think you have a little different perspective being a cold case homicide detective. So how does that aid you in looking at this issue of the resurrection?
Well, I think you're right in the sense that there's a number of ways to look at this, right? And a lot of us bring our own expertise to the game based on how we were trained or what we are skilled in. If I was an historian, I would be I'd be talking about it from the perspective of a historian. But I was none of those things when I was an atheist at the age of 35 and started to look at this. And I do think there's an aspect of this that is so similar to what you do when you're working cold cases. Because we are working events that are locked in history. These are murders, but they are locked in history. And they're locked in history just outside of my availability. So I typically have reports that are written about eyewitness accounts. I don't have access to those eyewitnesses. They've been dead for 10 years. Now, to be honest, once your witness is dead, I don't care if he's dead for 10 years or 10,000 years, he's not available to you either way. So the idea that this is a recent event in the past is still the same kind of event. Also, I don't even have access often to the report writers. The supplemental report writers are usually detectives back in the 70s. And they wrote a report based on what they learned from an eyewitness. But now the witness is gone, and so is the report writer. What does that sound like? That is exactly what we have in the Gospels. And it turns out that the process that we use to figure out, well, what really did happen, even though I have no access to witnesses or report writers, that's the same process I use to figure out what really did happen. And I will tell you that sometimes when we study the resurrection, it's easy to get caught up in academia on this. Here's what I mean.
Sure.
I see sometimes people will come up with theories trying to explain, for example, the differences they see in the accounts. Because Mark says one thing, and it seems like Luke's saying something kind of different, even though he seems to be using Mark as a source. And then you got Matthew's account, which is also slightly different. And if you just took the Passion account of Easter and compared all 4 Gospels, there are atheists out there that are challenging young Christians to do this because they feel that the differences are so dramatic that you'll shatter the faith of anyone who's ever considered the Passion Week.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out if you spend some time talking to witnesses who have recorded the same event, and by the way, historians don't typically get to do that, and literary critics don't get to do that, and textual critics don't get to do that. You don't get to do that. Detectives get to do that. So the thing that got me interested from the very beginning was that there were these differences in the accounts, which I would expect if they are reliable eyewitness accounts. What I have a tendency to kind of shrink from is when we develop an academic theory to explain away the differences between the accounts, when in reality, it's the differences between the accounts which draws them toward reliability. In other words, if you've interviewed enough witnesses, you will not, I'm not going to say, well, maybe there's a theory related to genre in 1975 that would allow these two witnesses to say something slightly different. No, there's no theory really. This is what eyewitnesses do. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what I try to do in a class like we have at Southern Evangelical Seminary is just talk about the nature of eyewitness testimony and the rules that we use in criminal trials to evaluate eyewitnesses in spite of the differences they may have in their accounts, and how if you applied that same technique to the differences you'll see in the Gospels, you won't need to run to an additional theory. You'll just see that this is exactly what we would expect them to look like. And this does not mean that these differences are necessarily contradictory. Remember, the one thing I ask people when I get dispatched to a homicide, because it's the middle of the night and I'm not wearing a suit. I got to get dressed. I got to get there. It's going to take me probably an hour and 15 minutes before I can be on scene. So I tell the dispatcher, have the officers on the scene do one thing for me, only one thing: separate the eyewitnesses. And the reason why I ask them to separate the eyewitnesses is if you don't separate them, you'll get one story 5 times.
Right.
What I'm looking for are the 5, even they might look contradictory at times, but the 5 slightly differing stories that I then, as the investigator, get to puzzle together to get the most robust sense of what really happened. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did with the Gospels, using that same approach. How do we puzzle these accounts together without saying I've got to call that not true, and I've got to say, well, that's an exaggeration, or that's okay. Maybe in the first century, it was okay to exaggerate. There's no need to go to these kinds of theories, because this is exactly what eyewitnesses do every day. Mm-hmm. And once you know that, it gives you a little better sense of confidence, number one. And number two, it kind of points you in a direction as to how to engage those differences, how to reconcile those differences. Because it turns out, if I went there and said, well, look, there's some differences here, so that I can never return to any truth about the crime scene, well, give me a break.
Sure.
By the way, defense attorneys love these differences because they're going to call them out. And I've got to teach a jury why the differences don't disqualify the witnesses. Mm. Well, the same thing is true when I'm sharing the Gospels with people. I have to teach them enough about eyewitness testimony that they will not disqualify the Gospels because there are differences in the Gospels.
Well, I think you make 2 important points there, that the differences don't necessarily entail contradictions, but also the skeptic who simply wants to find a reason not to believe, they're gonna harp on the differences as if that disqualifies them. But like you said, if they were all the same, then they would be harping on the fact that they're all the same, and they're going to conclude collusion or something in that respect.
Right. Well, I think sometimes there's a tug of war too with about understanding enough about, when we impanel a jury, we have a certain process by which we pick and impanel a jury. We don't put everyone on the jury. Some people are really disqualifying themselves based on their and the fact they will not relinquish a prejudice or a bias that's going to prevent them from judging the case fairly. And we have a voir dire process so we can figure out, well, who should be on the jury to begin with. Mm-hmm. And we don't often do that when we're talking to our friends and family, right? We're like, we want to share the gospel. I get it, but I have different expectations from different kinds of jurors. So that's part of the process. But most importantly, before I ever have that part of the jury trial called the evidence show, I have to give the jury some rules related to how evidence is evaluated so that they won't come to the wrong conclusion based on some preconceived notion they got from watching a TV show or whatever. So a lot of what I spend time on in my jury trials is we have a whole huge book. I've got it sitting behind me here. It is super fat, and it is just the jury instructions we use with jurors. And there's a set of instructions for every kind of case, for every kind of crime. So those jury instructions are designed to help jurors understand how to take the facts that I'm given and how do I come to an inference from those facts? What kinds of inferences are reasonable? What is reasonable doubt versus possible doubt? These are the kinds of things that we talk about with jurors. Well, when's the last time you spent time talking to somebody you care about in your family, or you're sharing the gospel with them, and you spend time talking about, well, how would you evaluate the things I'm about to tell you? We don't do that.
Right.
And then we sometimes wonder why we get different kinds of results. So the class we're trying to do at Southern Evangelical also is to try to help students understand some of the basic rules of evidence that then can be applied. And by the way, once you do that, I think it has a role to play in the larger conversation about the resurrection. That I think also there's a role that historians must play, a role that people who understand the original languages must play, a role that everyone plays in this process.
Mm-hmm.
What I hope is that what we're going to do in a class like ours is add to that larger case that you can make for the resurrection.
Right. And that's exactly why we teach a classical approach to apologetics here at SES, because you do have the philosophy, you do have the theology, you do have the epistemology, you do have all of these things that play a part in building this systematic case for the truthfulness of Christianity and these underlying necessary conditions, really, for the resurrection to even be an option to consider on the table. So, yeah, I appreciate that. In the class, again, we're talking with J. Warner Wallace today. The class that he's referencing is actually an asynchronous online course that he and Dr. Timothy Brown have done together here at SES, just a class on the resurrection, one of our required courses for our apologetics majors that we'll be offering again this coming spring 2019-2020 semester. So if you're interested in that, visit ses.edu to learn more. So what do you hope to accomplish? Well, not hope to accomplish, you've recorded the class, but for this next crop of students, what are some of the key things you hope they glean from this particular class?
Yeah, no, so you and I have all the same heroes and friends in this industry who are some of the best experts that you could possibly hope for, like Gary Habermas, like you mentioned, right? Gary's to me, he is one of my go-to guys when I talk about the resurrection or study the resurrection with anybody. Gary is that guy for me. So what we hope to do is to help students also not only master some essential facts related to the resurrection, but also learn to be good translators and communicators of those facts to others. Does that make sense? Because I think what happens is sometimes we can master facts.
Right.
And boy, it's so easy to retreat back to the kind of language, the kind of approach. So for example, I learned a long time ago that I could master these facts. And if I communicate them in a more academic way that I love, I have audiences that aren't interested in that approach.
Right.
If I said, well, look, imagine you're in a crime scene and you saw this. Oh, okay, I can get that. Well,
Yeah.
That's because we have been saturated with media right now. We have
CSI.
channels that are continuing to grow. ID channel is entirely crime shows. And now Oxygen, that network, is moving over to the same kinds of programming. I'm like, wow, how many cop and detective shows could one country consume? Well, apparently more than I would like, okay? But my point is that those kinds of references are a part of the pop culture in which we live. Mm-hmm. And this is why, if you look at the entire plethora of apologetics, popular lay-level apologetics books that are on the market, they almost always stand on language, evidence that demands a verdict, the case for Christ. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're always on language that kind of references this kind of investigation often.
Right.
And for the most part, those are not people who have ever spent any time in a jury trial. They've never actually tried a case in front of a jury. So what we want to do is help students. If you were to try this in front of a jury, what are some of the rules you'd have to consider? How do we take the facts? Because the expert witnesses we would call in a jury trial are experts on material evidence. They're experts on behaviors. There's all kinds of experts I'm going to call, but they don't get a vote on the jury. We have to help the jury then. Have to help translate what the experts we called. What does that mean for the jury? We do that in the closing argument. Mm-hmm. And then we help the jury to take that high-level information from an expert and act upon it based on how we translate it to them. And the defense tries to do the same thing. So what we want to do in a class like ours right now at SES is to say, hey, we want to help you not only understand the facts, but we're going to reference those experts. And then we want to help you translate that for your jury.
Right.
And that could be to the people that you're teaching at your church. That could be the future of what you're going to do as an apologist in America or wherever country you're in. That could just simply be what you're going to do with your friends and family, because you're going to take the skill set you develop at SES and or it could be because you're pastoring a church. Again, at some point, you're going to have to take expert testimony and translate it for your jury. It could be your congregation or whatever it is.
Yeah.
That's what we want to be able to help you do with a class like this.
Yeah, that's great imagery, and so easy for us as apologists and philosophers to forget that translation process so much of the time. And we want people to love things as much as we love it and get in the weeds and just start digging and just have fun with it as much as we do. I love arguing. Come on, what's the matter with you?
Well, we just had ETS, right? About 2 weeks ago. And that's why I haven't shaved since ETS, right? So I always kind of keep my Dateline appearance until the last speaking event. For me, that was at the EPS conference after ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society. Mm-hmm. But, if you go to those talks, those are your expert witnesses.
Yep.
That most of us, if we're leading congregations or we want to translate for a community, now some of us are going to become those experts. Mm-hmm. And I think it still doesn't hurt us then to figure out, well, okay, in the end, I know that whatever I do in the street as a police officer, whatever I do in the course of my investigation as a detective, in the end, the rubber hits the road when it's spoken in front of a jury. Because I can do all of that. And if I can't communicate it in front of a jury and I don't get that verdict I'm looking for, all of that other stuff was for nothing.
Yep.
So I start from the beginning when I'm still with the suspect before there's even hooks on that guy. I'm not thinking about the arrest or about the filing or about the preliminary hearing. I'm thinking about what am I doing today that makes sure we convict this guy in a jury trial. So when I look as an apologist, I'm saying, what am I doing today that prepares me for the thing I really have to do, which is to be persuasive in front of whoever my jury is.
Yeah.
And for some of you who are going to attend our classes, your jury is going to be people at ETS. You're going to be the expert we're going to rely on. For some of you, though, your jury are going to be the lay people in your congregation. And that's why I think, SES does a great job of providing with that kind of scope of curriculum that allows you to, I don't think I can think of another seminary anywhere in the world that is as committed to helping you develop the apologetic skills to communicate at a lay level, to translate really difficult material sometimes in a way that's persuasive. That is the apologetics project, really. And that's why I'm glad to be part of this.
Well, we're glad to have you as part of it. And that really is our passion. Dr. Geisler, our co-founder, even put on our school seal when it was founded, evangelism and apologetics. It's not all the philosophy, the apologetics and all that for ends in themselves, but ultimately in service to evangelism and to lead people to the gospel. And sometimes that means the academics and all that stuff that we've talked about. But ultimately, right. We want to equip people to engage their culture wherever that sphere is for them that God has placed them. We want them to be able to engage effectively in that sphere, and that requires a lot of work.
About that? Yeah, what's funny about that is that Richard Land, he a couple of years ago, he wrote an article and saying that really in this generation in time, evangelism is spelled apologetics, apologetics. It's spelled apologetics. That's how you spell evangelism in this culture, in this century, in this time. So I wrote an article about this, quoting Richard and citing him and linking back to the article where I can't tell you how many people have quoted me in a meme as though I said it. No, I didn't say it. Richard said it. And he said it because this is what SES does. And does uniquely, if you think about it. Now, I've got a seminary degree. I've got a seminary degree in theology. And at the time I got the degree, my seminary did not, and it's a good seminary, that did not offer a single class in apologetics. Now, here we are, 15 years later, and they still don't offer the classes in apologetics. There are places you could go.
Sure.
And get a great degree and to prep you to become a pastor or just to become involved in ministry of any kind, where you could go through the entire thing, 72 units, whatever it may be, and never receive a single class in apologetics. And now, if it's true that we are in a culture today where evangelism is spelled apologetics, that's what you're basically saying is you could go places and get a degree and never really be properly prepared for evangelism in this generation. Mm-hmm. That's not what SES is, though. That's what I hope. And I know this is why I partner with you guys, because I feel like this is where the work is, heavy lifting is really happening.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you sharing our heart with that. And We love to see what I think gets me mostly excited. I'm director of recruiting now at SES, and to have a pastor or somebody who's desiring to be a pastor call us up and inquire about being a student. And yes, the church is where we need this. You don't have to do apologetics every moment. You don't have to have conferences every weekend. Just work it into your sermons in your daily ministry, and just ooze it out of what you do, and the church will just gradually glean from that. And so that excites me when people really want to just incorporate that into their DNA of ministry, and not just be a separate thing that they do, but just that's just how they do ministry.
Well, that's what's so important about what we're doing at SES, because it's not as though we have this approach. We offer 4 classes in this, so you can, if you're interested, it's like there's no way to get through these programs without becoming a better Christian case maker.
Yeah.
And so if you're going to be a pastor, I just don't know where else you could go to be properly equipped for evangelism in 2020 if it's not SES. Because if it doesn't have this ethos in which you are willing, and I talk about this in a book I wrote called So the Next Generation Will Know, where we talk about how Gen Z needs 2 whys for every what. That's what's not happening right now in the church for them. The culture is doing that for every other case that could be made online. The 2 whys are, okay, the what is what the easy part. And a lot of us as seminaries, we teach what's.
Yeah, right.
What is true about the Bible? What is true about the nature of Jesus, the nature of God? What?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't teach the 2 whys for each what. The first why is, well, why is that true? And I need to know robustly, as an accumulative way. And I want you to take me both in Scripture and out of Scripture. I want from natural revelation, from special revelation. I want to see, why is this true, this claim you're making? And if you don't think young people are interested in the why, okay, then you're not probably working with young people.
Yeah.
The second why, though, is, okay, you've told me what is true, and you've given me some evidence for that. Why should I care? This idea of why and how this applies to the life of young people,
right,
is where passion comes from. I could be interested in something, but when you show me how it explains my challenges today, how what I'm experiencing in life today is directly connected to a theological principle that can be supported with evidence, everything changes.
Yeah.
And that's why I say, if we don't develop programs in seminary that help graduates, future pastors, whatever, give 2 whys for every what, we will lose that generation. So I would also say, if you think you're interested in the most important generation in the church, which, by the way, is the next generation, it's always going to be that way, then you better sign up at SES, because we'll give you the skill set you need to reach the next generation.
Well, let's do that right now. So we're talking about this resurrection class that we have coming up this spring, and obviously we don't have time to get into all the details, but let's do the 2 whys. So what's your probably let's just say your favorite why the resurrection is true, your favorite line of evidence for that, and why it matters?
Well, I'm writing a new book right now in which I'm basically making a case for the deity and a historicity of Jesus, as though there is no scripture ever written about him. If you lost it all, you had no documents, no manuscripts existed, could you still make a case for the existence and resurrection of Jesus? Well, it turns out you could. And I want to show why that's so powerful. There's oftentimes in my criminal work where I have no crime scene because we didn't work it as a homicide. 10 years later, we decided it was a homicide. Now we got no crime scene to return to. It was never considered to be a homicide until 10 years after the fact. How do you make cases when there's no crime scene? It's the same way you can make a case for Jesus if there was no manuscript evidence. So I think it's possible to do that. But what we do in our class is we stay in that crime scene. If there's an event that occurred in history, like a crime, we have to ask ourselves the question, which explanation best fits the evidence we can all agree on? So, Gary Habermas has done a little bit of this in his minimal facts approach. But I, as an atheist, would never have given you as many of those minimal facts as he would have. So what I start with is the bare minimum of what I, as an atheist, would have said at the age of 35. Okay, I agree about this. I don't believe that Christianity is true, but I think that's true about Jesus. I don't agree that Christianity is true, but I think that second thing is true. So if you just started with that stuff, now the question is, and this is true for every investigation, is what cause makes the most sense given the evidence at the scene. And that's what we do in our class. We will go through every potential possible explanation for the evidence in the crime scene and see if any of them makes sense. Which of those is the most reasonable given the evidence at the scene? And there's lots of ways, there's like 6 ways as an atheist you could account for the evidence in the scene. Mm-hmm. And there's only one way we do it as a Christian. We think that actually the resurrection occurred. Okay, sure. But I want to go through, and this is true of when I do this in criminal trials, I have defense attorneys who have their view they want the jury to adopt, and I have my view I want the jury to. The question is, which of these 2 views is more reasonable in light of the evidence we all agree on? Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we're going to do in our class, is we're just going to take it an evidential way. Because in the end, whoever you're talking to, if you ask them, well, tell me why you pause when it comes to the resurrection, what is it that gives you, what do you think really happened? They've got a view. Mm-hmm. The question is their view substantiated by the evidence, even the evidence that they would agree to? Or is your view as a Christian the most reasonable, and it points to the most reasonable inference? And this is how we solve, this is what we do we'll start with the crime scene in our class, and we'll move through what we do at death scenes to determine if we have a crime scene. And then we'll talk about how that relates to the empty tomb of Jesus. Why do we believe there's an empty tomb? All kinds of different things we'll cover. But again, it's all going to be based on evidence and inferences. This is true for every investigation we work. We're always comparing inferences rather to evidence, mm-hmm. and trying to determine which one is. So this is the problem, of course, with that is, if you said, well, Jim, what is the one piece of evidence that convinced you Christianity is true? There's never one piece that convinced me that guy is the guy who did it. Never. If there was, probably, I'm working cold cases, okay? These are cases that were lame to begin with, okay? Because that's why they didn't get solved. So I make cases cumulatively from indirect evidence. Never lost a case. It's a very powerful way to make a case. But it takes time to unwrap because these are cumulative cases. Mm-hmm. Now, what we're going to try to do in our class is to give you a way to move through this that's very brief. But in the end, I want you to master all of it because you don't know which way that person you're talking to is going to go. He's going to pick one of these explanations. Yeah. But I want you to be able to be prepared to show why that makes no sense in light of the evidence. And so that's what we try to do. But again, I have people ask me all the time, what was the one thing that suddenly convinced you Christian? That didn't work that way. It took me 6 months. Mm-hmm. And searching through mostly primary documents, right? Because I wasn't sure who I could trust. I didn't trust Christians. So I had to take out my text. I got back to the manuscripts I could find. This is back in 1996 or 5. So I mean, it was not a great internet age at that time. But I tried to get back to the church fathers and all kinds of things that happened as close as I could to the first century to see evidentially what is the most reasonable inference. And we're going to talk about all of that in the class.
And of course, the why it matters is the resurrection is probably the easiest answer with that. Paul answers that for us very blatantly in 1 Corinthians 15.
That's right. Let me give you an example of why SES works is so powerful. Okay, because for young people, because in the end, if you're making a case for whatever the thing might be, a triune nature of God, or give you an example of this, we see right now for Gen Z, they will self-report that they are the loneliest generation. The highest rating of self-reported loneliness of any generation. Mm-hmm. Yet this is the one generation that is the most connected socially with their friends on social media. How can both things be true at the same time? Well, it turns out there's a theological answer for this. That is, we can say that what? You think about this. We as Christians, we do not, our claim is not that we will die and that we will at some point live forever as disembodied spirits with God. No, actually, the claim is we will be reunited with a resurrection body. Really, why do we need that? Why is there this importance about body and spirit? Mm-hmm. Why can we just not just live just as disembodied spirits with God? Well, there's something about the physical body theologically that accounts for what our young people are experiencing right now on social media. You can have the most robust disembodied relationships you can think of, but if you're not in someone's physical presence, your body matters. Mm. Your proximity to other physical bodies matter.
Yep.
And if you deny that one aspect of who you are, you will sense a loneliness you didn't expect. Because to see that person as disembodied on the screen is not the same as being in their physical company.
Yeah.
And that is because we are designed in the image of God with the physical bodies that he has designed for us, that we will still keep some physicality in the next life, because that's part of who we are. And God comes to us in a physical body because he understands that what he's created has this need for, in other words, we can go to a theological principle, offer support for why this is true, and then show why this accounts for something you're experiencing in your life right now.
Right.
This stuff that seems so abstract and esoteric and so academic, so theological, actually, the rubber does meet the road for you someplace.
Yeah.
On those kinds of claims. The Christian claims end up addressing the most pressing problems and issues that face Gen Z. But they have not been shown how that abstract theological principle that was, your grandfather used to talk about has any impact on my life today on Instagram.
Yeah.
When in fact it does.
Yeah. Well, if that doesn't pump you up, I don't know what will. This is it's good stuff. So if you like it, check out ses.edu. You can learn more about the upcoming resurrection class and many other offerings that are coming up this winter and spring. Jim, I don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you for being with us, but you mentioned a new project you're working on, and where can people go to learn more about you specifically and what you're up to?
Yeah, for now, we're still hosting everything at coldcasechristianity.com. We try to produce 5 pieces of content a week. Now we're shifting more toward video because that's the nature of the culture we're in, and we want to be early adopters. So we do 3 videos a week, an article a week, and a podcast a week, and you can get that all at coldcasechristianity.com. And we have a children's series because, again, Gen Z is my heart is really working with young people as well. And so we have a thing called the casemakersacademy.com, where we host 3 separate academies for 8 to 12-year-olds at casemakersacademy.com.
Excellent. And once again, I think you should keep the goatee. I like it.
Okay, thanks. I will give it proper consideration.
I really do appreciate you taking the time to be with us. Always wonderful insights and great perspective to maybe a fresh perspective for a lot of people to think about some of these things that possibly become too familiar to us as apologists. So thank you for what you're doing. Keep it up.
Thanks, brother. Thank you.
And again, you can learn more about becoming a student, whether degree, certificate, audit, all of the above at ses.edu. And until next time, God bless.
Providing an integrated approach to theology, philosophy, and apologetics that will equip you to proclaim the gospel, engage the culture, and defend the truth. That's SES.